What is up, everybody? UFC 298 is going to be taking place this weekend. This is going to be my breakdown of the entire slate. Going to be going fight by fight and also showing you some of the data from the Sims tool that we have at Stochastic.com that helps me build my lineups. It's been a great year for me in MMA DFS so far. Last week was actually the first time the entire year that I did not have a lineup finish at least top two in one of the GPPs over at DraftKings. But overall, really liked my new process using the Sims tool. Going to be walking you guys through that here. And also did a giveaway last week. $50 to whoever it was that could guess the highest scoring fighter, price sub 8K. And my highest exposed punt option last week was Bogdan Guskov. And a lot of you guys followed suit. Actually, about half of the comments were from people that took Guskov, and he did end up being the highest scorer who was priced in that 7K range. So I threw everybody in a spreadsheet and did a random number generator. And the winner, which I have written down right here, was Agent Cody Danks, 6666. So Agent Cody Danks, 6666. Either leave me a comment below with the best way to send you the money, whether it's Venmo or whether it's through PayPal, or if you're more comfortable, you could DM me on Twitter. My DMs are open over there, and you can get in touch with me that way. So congrats to Agent Cody Danks, 6,666, because you won yourself $50 by guessing Guskov as the highest punt option scorer last week. And I'll do more of these giveaways as we go this year. But that was how I wanted to start off this show. Wanted to give away some money. And now let's go ahead and start breaking down UFC 298. Starting with the main event, we've got Alexander Volkanovski taking on Ilia Topuria. And the betting line is fairly wild for this fight, in my opinion. It's taking a lot of assumptions into account about the potential fall of Alexander Volkanovski, the potential rise of Ilia Topuria, to the point where it's nearly a pick'em right now. It was an opening line of Volk being north of a -200 favorite, and it's been bet all the way down to, it actually was -110 on both sides at one point. Now we're seeing Volk a little bit more of a favorite, but still close to a pick'em. And I actually do have a bet on this fight on Alexander Volkanovski. I bet him -125 on the money line. And it's not to say that I don't think Topuria is live to win the fight. That's not the case at all. It's just that for the fight to be a pick'em, we are assuming that Volkanovski is removed from his prime and that Topuria is going to be making massive strides from his previous fights, which are both things that could happen. I'm just not sold on that being the case. And Volkanovski, in my opinion, is the greatest featherweight ever. And then also a lot of the numbers really do dictate that if this fight is going to finish not inside the distance, but it's going to be an extended fight, that it's going to favor Volkanovski. He lands 6.19 significant strikes per minute compared to 4.44 for Ilia Topuria. And I don't think that Topuria is going to be the minutes winner in this fight. I think Volk is going to be the minutes winner. Now, where Topuria is live is that Volkanovski was knocked out just a few months ago in a short notice fight against Islam Makhachev, which I think was ill-advised for him to take that fight. And potentially there's still residual effects of that, including the fact that Volkanovski is now 35 years old. Historically, fighters who are 35 and older do not fare all that well in title fights. Once fighters in lighter weight classes start to get to this age, they lose a step, and then frequently that ends up being the difference between them winning and losing. But that aside, I'm not convinced that Volkanovski has lost a step. It seems to be that's what the public opinion is because of the fact that he didn't look great in his last fight. He got knocked out by Islam Makhachev in the first round, but he took the fight on 10 days' notice. He was clearly not in shape for the fight. He had even said himself that he was drinking nearly every day leading up to that fight because he didn't know he was going to have a fight on the horizon. So I'm willing to just totally write off what happened in the last fight. And I do think the betting line is a pretty big overreaction, him getting finished by who I believe in Islam is the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the sport. So as far as my exposures go here, we do have Volkanovski, who's an excellent DraftKings scorer, is my most rostered fighter on the entire slate. And I'm looking at like a 70-30 split. It's a fight I want to be all in on. Right now, my exposures, I do have 73% of Volkanovski to a 26% of Ilia Topuria here. So right around, I'm thinking something like a 70-30 split between the two, leaning towards Volkanovski, picking him to win and retain his belt and get back on the winning ways. However, if Topuria does win, it's likely to come by knockout, in my opinion, probably come with a pretty big score. So that's why I'm getting myself some exposure to Topuria, but Volk, clearly my personal preferred option for this fight. Co-main event, we've got Robert the Reaper Whittaker taking on Paulo Costa, and Costa really looked great on the scale. Seemed to make weight fairly easily, which has been an issue for him in the past. We do know that Costa was scheduled to fight a few months ago, but he was dealing with a staph infection with his elbow. Seemed like he wanted to fight through it, but the UFC doctor stepped in, wouldn't let him fight. But as far as this matchup goes, I think the betting line is a little bit too wide. And as a result, Paulo Costa is one of the definite live underdogs that I'm liking for this card. Because if you look at the last fight that Robert Whittaker had against Dricus du Plessis, what ended up happening in that fight? First of all, I was very far off on this fight. I gave du Plessis very, very little chance to win. And rewatching the fight, I really think the physicality of du Plessis was a massive issue for Robert Whittaker. He was not able to keep du Plessis off of him. When du Plessis was advancing, Whittaker just didn't really have answers for him. There are rumors that Whittaker was dealing with an ankle injury for that fight, but, fighters are banged up heading into fights all the time. And as far as this matchup goes against Paulo Costa, Costa is massive for this weight class. And not to say that Whittaker is necessarily undersized, but Whittaker used to fight down a weight class, and Paulo Costa, not all that long ago, took a shot at fighting at 205. He had a fight, actually, that he took against Marvin Vettori where he wasn't able to make 180 pounds. They ended up fighting at, I think that was 205 pounds they ended up fighting at. But the point being, Paulo Costa is just physically the much bigger person than Robert Whittaker in terms of overall mass. And I do think that Paulo Costa could implement some of the same physicality that Dricus du Plessis did. Not that I'm expecting Paulo Costa to be shooting for takedowns against Robert Whittaker or anything like that, but I could see him just marching forward and just really putting out a lot of output, hurting Whittaker on the feet. I also have a lot of concerns about Whittaker's durability because not only did he get knocked out in the fight against du Plessis, we also saw him get knocked down against Israel Adesanya in their rematch. In the first fight against Izzy, he got knocked down twice and ultimately knocked out. And there's been other times, too, where Whittaker, even though he hasn't been finished in some of these fights, like the wars against Yoel Romero, he got hurt on the feet multiple times in some of those fights. So Yoel Romero in the second fight between them, he also knocked Whittaker down twice. So I do have some concerns about the durability of Whittaker. As far as DraftKings goes, Whittaker's also not a great DraftKings scorer. So my clear preferred option for this fight is going to be Paulo Costa. I'm going to be underweight to the field on Whittaker. And Costa is in a bucket of punt plays that I think are live to win and have a lot of DFS upside. So Paulo Costa, he is going to be my pick to win the fight. And in addition to that, like him a good amount for DraftKings purposes. Even if I was picking Whittaker to win, I wouldn't love getting to him for DraftKings just because he generally does tend to have a limited upside in 3-round fights. Jeff Neal against Ian Gary. And this is another fight where I feel pretty similarly about the Whittaker-Costa fight. The line is just a little bit too wide here. Ian Gary has had some very impressive performances, but I'm still questioning some of his ability to be a champion type level fighter. And that kind of seems to be the path that people are expecting him to be on. But here's some of the issues I have with Ian Gary in his previous performances. Sure, he went out and he beat Neil Magny in his last fight, but it was a fight that Magny was taking on short notice. He didn't really look prepared for the fight, and Magny offered zero resistance, and Gary was still not able to finish him in that fight, wasn't even able to knock him down. He beat Daniel Rodriguez, another fight, which was taken on short notice by D-Rod. The fight against Saul Kanan, Ian Gary gets a third-round finish, but Kanan nearly finished him in the first round. And then we also saw something which was a little concerning to me. The UFC debut of Ian Gary, sure, he got a first-round finish late in the first round against Jordan Williams, but Jordan Williams was outstriking him in the first round, numerically did outland him 22-18. So Ian Gary has fought a pretty easy strength of schedule. And then even some of his wins against some other opponents like Neil Magny, Daniel Rodriguez, it was fights against opponents who were taking these fights on short notice. So to this point, Ian Gary to me is pretty much not somebody I have a whole lot of confidence in being an upper-ranked, high echelon title contender type fighter. He could be, but this betting line is priced as if he's already one of those kinds of guys, like right around a -200 favorite against a proven commodity in Jeff Neal. So big step up in competition for Ian Gary. Due to volume, I am going to pick him to win, but I think this is a much closer fight than the betting line indicates. Jeff Neal is also very difficult to finish, and considering the price point on Ian Gary, I think that he needs a finish to be somebody who scores really well. Not just a finish, I think he needs to be somebody who finishes in the first round to score really well relative to his price tag. So I do lean slightly towards Ian Gary because of the higher output, but for DFS purposes, I prefer Jeff Neal, who is currently in... Let's see. Yeah, so getting to Jeff Neal in right around 20% of my lineups right now. I think that he's another one of the live underdogs we have to look at on this card. Next fight here, we've got Merab Dvalishvili against Henry Cejudo. And this is a tricky one to break down. We know what Merab's game is. He's a great DraftKings scorer. He lands 6.55 takedowns per 50 minutes, which, believe it or not, is not even the highest mark of any fighter on this card. That's going to go to Anthony Fluffy Hernandez, who we're going to talk about in a little bit. So Merab, an excellent DraftKings score, 4.46 significant strikes land per minute, 6.55 takedowns. So he's extremely active. Here's my concern, though. Henry Cejudo is an Olympic gold medal wrestler. I don't know that we could just expect Merab to run through him and land a million takedowns like he does in every other fight. Just due to output and the age of Cejudo, I'm certainly favoring this fight to go towards Merab, but I do somewhat question what his fantasy potential is in this fight because of the wrestling pedigree of Henry Cejudo. So we've seen fights where Merab hasn't been able to land takedowns. For example, the fight against Jose Aldo. He went 0 for 16 on takedown attempts. He ends up winning the fight. He landed 57 significant strikes, 135 total strikes, but he put up a pretty shitty DraftKings score. We also saw Merab in a fight against John Dodson. Here it is. Only lands 2 takedowns in the fight. Goes 2 of 20 on takedown attempts, 50 significant strikes, 88 total strikes. So another fairly crappy DFS score. So I do pick Merab to win. I expect him to win the fight. He's typically a great DraftKings scorer in his wins, but I am questioning that a little bit in this particular matchup. So I'm not going to be massively high on this fight for either side for that reason. Now, the next fight we have here is Anthony Hernandez taking on Roman Kopylov. And I just talked about the just insane metrics as far as the takedown attempts and the takedowns landed for Merab. But we've got some of the same situation here with Anthony Hernandez, who lands 6.79 takedowns per 15 minutes and also lands 4.33 significant strikes per minute. So a super active fighter in Anthony Hernandez. His recent fights, he landed 8 takedowns against Josh Fremd, 8 against Marc-Andre Barrio. He landed 6 against Edmund Shabazian. This is a little bit of a more difficult matchup for him against Roman Kopylov, but the same thing could be said on the Kopylov side. I think this is the stiffest level of competition that he's fought in the UFC. So this is a fight where I view it being as Kopylov is either going to finish Anthony Hernandez in the first round or sometime in the early second round. And if he doesn't do that, I think the pace and the pressure of Anthony Hernandez is going to take over. So Kopylov's wins typically come by finish. But in times we've seen him extended, he does noticeably start to fatigue a little bit and slow down in the later stages of fights, which you just simply cannot do against Anthony Hernandez. So Kopylov is live for an early finish, but if that doesn't materialize, I think Anthony Hernandez puts up a pretty big score, lands a bunch of takedowns, and probably gets himself a second or third round submission. So my preferred target in this fight is going to be Anthony Hernandez. And he's also one of my most rostered fighters right now, showing up in 41% of my top lineups here in the Sims. So somebody who I really do like here in Anthony Hernandez. I gave him an ROI boost that he'd show up in a little bit more of my lineups. That's one of the things you could do in the Sims here is you simulate out the whole slate. And while it's going to tell you which fighters are best to play based on which lineups aren't expected to be duped and the betting lines and things along those lines, if you have your own input, you could go into the ROI boost. You could upgrade or downgrade individual fighters. So it'll give you the fighters you want, but it'll also do it in a way where it's going to give you the fighters you want in lineups that aren't expected to be duped as heavily. And if you guys want to sign up for our Sims tool, which has helped me immensely this year, you can sign up using the link that we have below. It's helped me come in second or better in at least one GPP in every single slate this year, other than last week being the only one that's happened so far this year. So it's definitely really helped me improve my process. But let's move on to the rest of the fights on the card. And a lot of good ones to target here for DFS purposes. This one included Mackenzie Dern against Amanda Lemos. And Dern taking this fight on somewhat late notice, about a month, I think, or maybe 3 weeks that Dern's taking this fight. She was the last fighter to weigh in today, which is maybe a little bit of an indication that she had a hard weight cut, but she did look fine on the scales. But this is a pretty classic striker versus grappler matchup. And I do think it's as binary as that. If Mackenzie Dern lands a takedown, I think she probably submits Amanda Lemos. If she doesn't land takedowns, I think Lemos probably knocks her out. Lemos hits as hard as any woman on the UFC roster right now. And Mackenzie Dern is very hittable, doesn't have the best striking defense. And if she isn't able to land takedowns, don't be surprised if this fight ends up looking like the fight against Jessica Andrade, where Andrade got a second round finish and knocked down Dern 4 times in that fight. So this is a great fight to target. I like both sides of it. I don't really have a strong lean. It's one that I'm going to be about even on both sides on. And let's see. Here we go. What's the current exposure I have here as of now? I have Lemos in, here's Dern in 20% of lineups. And then Lemos. Why can I? Oh, here she is. I've got Lemos in 27%. So I'm actually probably inclined to do a little bit of an ROI boost upgrade to get a little bit more of both Lemos and Dern, because I do think the winner of this fight should score fairly well. I think it finishes inside the distance, either Lemos by KO or Dern by submission. Let's go ahead and see what fight we have next on the card. We've got another weird one here, Marcos Rogerio de Lima against Junior Tafa. So initially, it was supposed to be de Lima taking on Justin Tafa. And then what happens? Justin Tafa has to pull out due to an injury. At least at the time I'm recording this, they haven't specified what that injury is. And I'm thinking like, oh, well, this is only a 12-fight slate. Kind of sucks. We're down to 11 fights. It's going to create a lot of dupes. But what ends up happening, Junior Tafa, Justin Tafa's brother, who's also going to be cornering his brother, he's a heavyweight in the UFC, and he was like, hey, I could fight instead. Just took his shirt off, got on the scale. They're heavyweights, right? It's not like he has any weight to cut or anything. Steps on the scale, weighed 249 pounds. Good to go. We've got a new fight matched up here, and it's a pretty similar matchup as well. And we don't have much in terms of betting lines for this. The opening line did a Marcos Rogerio de Lima at -250. It got bet down a little bit, so actually, let me look because it's probably moving as I'm recording this. So let's see. The most updated line that we have here. Yeah, no prop bets up. Just check that really quick. What I'm interested in is Marcos Rogerio de Lima by submission. If we could get a line plus 600 or better on Marcos Rogerio de Lima by submission, that's something I'm certainly going to be biting on, but still waiting on that. So yeah, the line opened at -250. It was bet down to around -170, and now it's swollen back up. So now we got to Lima right around -200 at the time that I'm recording. And yeah, I think this is a pretty good matchup on paper for Marcos Rogerio de Lima. Junior Tafa has big power, kickboxing background. He's certainly live to hurt Marcos Rogerio de Lima on the feet, but de Lima has generally been fairly durable as far as heavyweights go, with the exception being his last fight against Derek Lewis. Listen, he got KO'd by Derek Lewis. That happens. Derek Lewis hits extremely hard, but you look at other fights that Marcos Rogerio de Lima has had, he's fought plenty of hard-hitting guys in the heavyweight division in the UFC, and he's been finished on occasion by submission, but we haven't really seen Marcos Rogerio de Lima hurt and knocked out in fights outside of that fight that he had against Derek Lewis. So if he's able to keep himself safe against Junior Tafa, I really like his ability to potentially land takedowns and get himself a submission. We have seen Marcos Rogerio de Lima with multiple submissions on his resume. And in a fight against Muhammad Usman, we saw Junior Tafa taken down a couple of times. He was also controlled against the cage at points in that fight, and he just had nothing for Usman when his back was on the ground. And I view this certainly being a fight where Junior Tafa is seeing a much more uphill battle in terms of if he is taken down, getting back to his feet. So if he was stuck on the ground against Muhammad Usman, he sure as hell is going to be stuck on the ground against Marcos Rogerio de Lima as well. So I'm picking Rogerio de Lima to win by submission, and also somebody who I have a ton of exposure to in the mid-range right now. I have him in 41% of my lineups. Hardly getting to any of Junior Tafa. I'm interested to see what the ownership projections end up being when there's more information and some more of our data updates, because this is so fresh in terms of the news coming out. But right now, Marcos Rogerio de Lima at first run projected for 33.3% ownership, and I am overweight to that mark. Let's see what we have for our next fight. We've got Rinya Nakamura taking on Carlos Vera, and I typically don't roster the 9,600 fighters all that often for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's just a difficult path for them to make the optimal lineup because they're so expensive. But then also, even if they put up a big score, you need some punt plays. You need some underdogs to come through for you. Here's why this slate is one where I like getting to Nakamura. We have a lot of live underdogs that I've already talked about liking on this slate, right? We've already hit on Paulo Costa. We have hit on Jeff Neal being a live underdog. And then there's also fights in the mid-range, like Marcos Rogerio de Lima, like targeting him. Lemos against Dern, that's in the mid-range. I like targeting that fight. The main event is an $8,200, $8,000 fight. There are not that many fighters I like as pay-up options, and I really do like mixing and matching a lot of punt plays. Like, there's nobody I'm going crazy with and getting to like 50 or 60% exposure as a punt, but there are fighters who I'm getting like 20 to 30% of, like Paulo Costa, like Jeff Neal, and that's kind of making it easy for me to get up to Nakamura. And Nakamura is now been bet all the way up to a minus 1,400 favorite. And this is an elite prospect, in my opinion. See, Nakamura currently in 47% of my lineups, my second most rostered fighter at the moment, behind Alexander Volkanovski. So what to me is really interesting about Nakamura as a prospect is he seemingly can do everything. He has a wrestling background, but in addition to that, massive power on the feet. In his road to the UFC fight, he ended up landing 2 knockdowns and then got a finish in so this is the one right here. 2 knockdowns against Toshiyama Kazama and ends up getting a finish in 33 seconds. His road to the UFC fight prior to that, 2 knockdowns, got a finish in 2 minutes and 21 seconds. He did struggle to finish Fernie Garcia, but it was a fight where Nakamura landed a bunch of takedowns, held a lot of top control time, and really seemed to be hunting for a submission. I think if he would have just kept it on the feet, he probably would have knocked out Fernie Garcia. The point being, though, I think Nakamura could win this fight on the feet. I think he could win the fight wrestling. I think he could win the fight by wrestling and then grappling and getting himself a submission. Lots of paths to victory for Nakamura, and a lot of them include him scoring a lot of fantasy points. And I don't think this is one of these spots where you need the $9,600 fighter to go out and score 120 fantasy points for him to be in the optimal lineup. If you get a first or second round finish out of Nakamura and maybe a couple of these punt plays come through on the slate, I think Nakamura is live to be in the winning lineup, and he's a very safe bet to win as well. So Nakamura, core play for me that I really do like paying up for despite the price tag. Another fight in the mid-range that I really think we should be targeting, Zhang Mingyang taking on Brenson Ribeiro. And look at the striking stats between these guys. It is a small sample size, but from what we've seen from these guys on the Contender Series and being younger fighters, both of them landing north on the betting line. And then as far as the odds go for this fight to finish, it is currently minus anywhere from minus 300 to minus 330 to finish under 1.5 rounds. So considering where this fight is priced in the mid-range, I think the winner of this fight is going to put up a very good score for DraftKings purposes. I don't have a real lean on the fight. I'm going to be pretty even between the two. I guess if you're just playing one lineup and you had to pick one of them, I would say go towards Ribeiro just because of the price point. But I'm going to be super heavily exposed to this fight. Both this fight and the main event are two fights that I think should be in the majority of your lineups, if not all of them. I currently have Mingyang in 41% of lineups, Ribeiro in 34.7%. And if anything, I'd be inclined to even up that percentage to get these guys in a total of like 90+% of my lineups. I'm very confident this fight finishes. I think it finishes early, and I think the winner puts up a big score. So one of the best fights to target on the entire card. Few more fights left to talk about here. The next one is Josh Quinlan against Danny Barlow, another fight with a lot of finishing equity, and another underdog that I think is pretty live. So Danny Barlow is seemingly a pretty high upside prospect, but he's very raw. He's only been training for a couple of years, and it's not all that long ago that you could find fights of his where he was fighting outside of the UFC and was struggling a little bit with the takedown defense as well as the grappling defense. And Josh Quinlan, while we haven't seen him have much wrestling success to this point in the UFC, we did see in his last fight against Trey Waters, he attempted 8 takedowns in that fight. And I do think if he attempts 8 takedowns against Danny Barlow, he's probably going to have wrestling success and potentially even win this fight by submission. So I do think it's kind of a sneaky bet for this fight is Josh Quinlan to win by submission. Whoever wins another one, I think this fight does finish. I think should be a big score, but I'm leaning more towards the Quinlan side, mostly just because of what his price point is. So I'm going to pick Quinlan to win by submission. I'm not going to totally write off Danny Barlow. He is somebody to get exposure to. In my current run here, I've got Barlow in 26.7% of lineups. I've got Quinlan in 33.3%. And I also really like, we only have Quinlan project for 22.1% ownership. So on a condensed slate where it's, only 12 fights, there aren't that many fighters to choose from, Quinlan is a relatively low-owned option that I do like to differentiate some lineups. Moving on, a couple more fights left to talk about. We've got Oban Elliott against Val Woodburn, and I think the betting line is too wide for this fight. We've got Oban Elliott, who to me didn't look all that great on the Contender Series. I know that Karic Brito was not credited with a knockdown in this fight, but he knocked down Oban Elliott, and there's no doubt about that to me. He hurt Oban Elliott multiple times on the Oban Elliott's even talked about the fight, and he said that getting knocked down kind of woke him up, even though the stats keepers didn't credit Brito with a knockdown in this fight. And to me, Elliott is just somebody who's kind of an unproven commodity, and as a minus 300 favorite, that's just an insane line to me. I'm not confident enough on Val Woodburn to bet on him, but I'm certainly willing to play him in DFS, and I think he's going to be one of the lowest owned fighters on the entire card. When you look at Val Woodburn, I think people are really underestimating him just because in his UFC debut, he fought against Bo Nickel on short notice, and he just gets starched. He gets knocked out in 38 seconds. But the same thing would happen to Oban Elliott. If Oban Elliott fought Bo Nickel, he would also get knocked out. And here's what I think probably would happen. If Oban Elliott made his UFC debut on short notice against Bo Nickel, he would get knocked out in like a minute. And then if it was Val Woodburn making his UFC debut, I think this fight would be lined probably in the inverse way, where Val Woodburn would end up being favored in this fight. So I'm actually going to pick Val Woodburn to win. I'm going to pick him to win by KO. This is a super high variance fight. We don't know a whole lot about Oban Elliott. We don't know a whole lot about Val Woodburn. And with that in mind, I think it's crazy that books are looking at this fight and pricing one guy as a minus 300 favorite, which is why Val Woodburn at a $6,900 price tag is another punt play who I think is viable to roster to get some salary savings with. I currently have Val Woodburn in 17% of lineups, but he's only projected for 8% ownership. So definitely somebody who I like being overweight to. Oban Elliott also, he's shown to have some wrestling upside. He landed 4 takedowns on the Contender Series. So it's worth getting exposure to both sides of this fight. But when I do update my lineups and everything's set, by the time tomorrow rolls around, I'm more apt to get to more of Woodburn exposure than Oban Elliott. I have it fairly close right now. I'm going to give myself a little bit of a boost to Val Woodburn tomorrow to make sure I'm getting a little bit more of him. Now, the final fight on the card, this is one that I do not have very much interested in. Miranda Maverick against Andrea Lee. And Miranda Maverick has shown to have some wrestling upside. She lands 2.41 takedowns per 15 minutes. And then on the other side, only a 54% takedown defense for Andrea Lee. So I do think this is a fight where we could see Miranda Maverick have some wrestling success, but she's not somebody who scores all that well for DraftKings purposes. And then also, if the fight does end up taking place at distance, Andrea Lee is live to win in the striking exchanges. Miranda Maverick is not the best striker in the world. She's low output, only landing 3.71 significant strikes per minute. So I'm going to pick Miranda Maverick to win by decision, but considering how many fights have finishing equity on this slate, it's one of my least favorite ones to target on the entire slate. If you had to pick one side to play in DFS, I would lean more towards Andrea Lee just because she's cheaper, but this is an easy fight to avoid relative to all the other fights that we have on the slate. So that is going to do it for me, guys. If you have not done it yet, do me a big favor, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you have any questions for myself, you can leave them below in the comment section, or if you're a subscriber to Stokastic, I'm always hanging out in the Discord channel. I'm usually sweating the MMA events with everybody as well. And you can always ask me questions in there. So that's one of the perks of signing up at Stokastic. And if you do want to check out our Sims tool, which I highly recommend, it's really helped me, particularly to build lineups that are not expected to be duped, because it is going to weed out some of those lineups. Sign up using the link that we have below. So enjoy the card, guys. Good luck, and see you back here next week.